Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to Exploring Reality. I'm your host, Than Christopoulos. And today I have some friends with me. We're going to be responding to a TikToker named Captain Dadpool. And he made a response video to my friend Michael from Inspiring Philosophy. We'll be tackling his objections to traditional authorship today. Stay tuned. What's going on, guys?
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Oh, cool. All right. So before we get into
little moshing there during the intro there.
I made that specifically for Captain Dadpool because I don't know. I just felt like it'd be funny. So before we get into everything, everybody just introduce yourself. We can start with Michael. We'll go to Eric, and then we'll go to Stephen.
Yeah, I'm Michael Jones. I run Inspiring Philosophy. That's it.
I don't know if you guys know who he is, but go ahead, Eric.
No, I'm Eric Manning. I run the YouTube channel Testify. It's been going for about a couple of years, and so mostly focusing on defending the historical reliability of the Gospels, which is why I've been asked to be here.
And I'm Stephen Boyce. I'm with the Explore Christianity. Also have my own podcast called Facts. My main focus is on canon and text, and that's about it.
Awesome. Okay, so today we're responding to a video that Captain Dadpool made to you, Michael.
Yeah, so I made a TikTok video just on the reliability of the Gospels, responding to someone briefly. I was expecting a TikTok back and forth with some people. That's what I was actually hoping for, because I wanted to go more into Bockham's book. And then it didn't happen. And then out of the blue, Captain Dadpool did a YouTube response. And so I was like, well, it's 15 minutes. Why don't we just, let's see if I get some friends together to do a response to it on a hangout, and that'll be better than, me doing it by myself. Because right now I'm kind of swamped preparing for a debate with a Muslim apologist named Daniel Hakikachu in April. And so I figured, get some help on this one since I'm so brain fogged from all that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's just get into it. I got the video up here, and then let me know if you guys can't hear it. I'm going to start playing it. Just tell me when to pause whenever you want me to, okay?
Yeah, you could probably skip the first 19 seconds. I think that's how long his intro is.
Start here.
There you go.
Cool. Here we go.
There you go.
This counts, and none of them claim to be.
This is demonstrably false because the beloved disciple, the author of the Gospel of John, claims to be an eyewitness. Moreover, Luke says he got his information from eyewitnesses.
The author of John is not likely claiming to be an eyewitness here, nor is he claiming to be the beloved disciple. Read the verse again. This is the disciple who is testifying about these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. A similar passage can be found in chapter 19, verse 35. And he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true, and he knows he is telling the truth, so that you may believe. We know that his testimony is true. We know he is telling the truth. It's more likely that the author is referring to the testimony of someone else, just as the author of Luke did. The claim that John is the beloved disciple is problematic as well. In chapter 19:26, the author actually tells us who the beloved disciple is. So when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." According to the author of John's Gospel, Jesus himself identifies the beloved disciple as his brother James.
All right.
There's also good reason to believe.
Stop.
All right. Yep. Go ahead.
So, obviously there's a lot of problems there. There's several statements, and the James is a new one for me. I don't know about you guys, but there seems to be some major overreading here. Dadpool starts with the assumption that John isn't referring to himself in the third person, and we're going to discuss that more. So I just want to throw that out there, but so we can stick a pin in that. But it seems like that's an assumption that's being made there, even though that is a common way that people would write ancient history in the ancient world. When he says that the disciple who wrote these things down is identified, when you look at the passage in context, is what I'm trying to say. Let me pull it up. It's John 21, 20 through 24. It says, Peter saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. He was the one who reclined next to Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who is it that is going to betray you? Peter saw him. He said, Lord, what about him? Jesus said to him, if it is my will for that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me. So the rumor spread in the community that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say that he would not die, but he said, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them. He's written them. So, I mean, I guess I'm just a little confused on why that this is difficult. And then when you look at 1935, again, this assumes that the author would not refer to himself in the third person. But when you look at the text itself, it talks about the soldiers coming, they broke his legs, or the first man, and then they, not Jesus' legs, they broke the legs of the man next to him. And then the other person that was crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was dead. They didn't break his legs. But one of the soldiers, he took his spear, stuck it in the side, blood and water came out. And he who has seen this has testified. His testimony is true. And he knows that he is telling the truth so that you might believe. Earlier in the chapter, in verse 26, the narrator actually indicates that the disciple whom Jesus loved was standing there, right there at the foot of the cross. So the sentence, he knows that he's telling the truth, sounds like something that someone would say of oneself rather than another person.
Yep.
And so this is just like, again, a bizarre overreading to me.
Yeah, I'll say two things on this, and then you guys can jump in. So he makes a big. I mean, again, as Eric said, he says it is he who has written this thing, and we know that people like Thucydides, Xenophon, Polybius, Julius Caesar, and Josephus wrote about themselves in third person quite often. This was just a common thing. I think he might be making a big case about how the we statement comes in after this. We have testified to this. He says like this is the disciples' witness, and we. And so Bauckham actually has a whole chapter about this, or a whole section in one of his chapters on the transition from I to we in this verse. Is this a problem? Does this mean that it's not actually him who's writing it? Well, first of all, it could very well just be that this is mentioning a scribe that John is writing with. I mean, Paul quite often wrote through scribes, and it could very well be that. But also Raymond Brown says John 21:24 means no more that the claim that the beloved disciple is the one who has bore witness echoed in the written gospel. Because again, he says that he's written it. But here's what Richard Bauckham says about the transition from I to we in that verse. He says, John 21:24-25. In light of the previous examples, it is now unmistakable that 21:24 uses the we of authoritative testimony, the same person, the writer, the speaker of himself, first as the disciple who is testifying to these things. The third person reference is necessarily to make the transition from the narrative up to 21:23, in which he has appeared as a character in the third person, then now revealed as the author and directly addressing his readers. He switches to first person. He then uses first person plural, we know, because this is Johannian idiom when solemnly claiming the authority of testimony. Finally, he then goes back to first person singular, I suppose, as a natural way to address his readers when he's no longer a matter of solemn testimony. So he points out that it's quite a John-like theme to go from I to we statements. And he cites places like 3 John 1:9-12, 1 John 1:1-5, 1 John 4:11-16, and John 3:10-13. So it just seems like this is just what John does. He goes from I to we statements a couple times. And also James, Bauckham also points this out, that we can see examples from late Greek literature and from papyrus letters, which prove beyond possible doubt that I and we chased each other throughout these documents without rhyme or reason. So it was quite often for them to do this in Greek literature. And the only one to say other thing is about him trying to claim that James is the beloved disciple. First of all, that's just shooting himself in the foot. If James is an eyewitness, that's a pretty good case for the Gospel of John right there. But I mean, Jesus refers to his disciples as his brothers in places like John 20:17, and the disciples are also called brothers in John 21:23. It wouldn't be weird for him to look at a disciple who he called a brother and say, take care of your mother who is here, because he saw them as his brothers. So that doesn't follow that it has to be James.
Yeah. Adding on to the part about James, throughout John's gospel, the narrative is told from somebody who is in Jesus' inner circle. He's familiar with scenes where only the disciples were present, like their calling in 119, the trip to Samaria in chapter 4, that there was much grass where Jesus fed the 5,000 in 610. Visits to Jerusalem in chapters 7, 8, and 11. The writer knows the disciples' reactions. He knows their thoughts. He knows their feelings. Well, in John's gospel, even it says that his own brothers did not believe him.
John 7.
So it's John 7. It's just awfully funny. It just doesn't even make any sense. This is somebody who, at least writing, is like somebody who's constantly present, constantly there, very intimate with what's going on. It seems like Dadpool is just doing some kind of like a priori history that, like, okay, well, Jesus is Jewish, and he's gonna Joseph is dead, so who's going to take care of the brother? To my mother. Obviously, it's got to be my brother. And so, I mean, maybe that's where he's getting this from. But again, like you said, Michael, is like, he has an inner circle. His own brothers didn't believe him. It seems as if his mother maybe believed in him. Obviously, she gave birth to him as a virgin, and so he's putting her into the care of somebody who actually is a disciple, which just makes sense. So,
and a faithful one who's still with him at the cross when the others were not. And so, Bauckham is one of the best in Johannine writing. In fact, his dissertation was based on Johannine writing. I agree with Bauckham to a level on this too. I actually believe that all the Johannine literature, except for the book of Revelation, is actually group based. If you go to chapter 1 there, I mean, he says, we beheld his glory, the only glory of the begotten. And then at the end, it brings up this we, then it goes to first person. You find a similar statement in 2 John where actually the writer says, and you know, our testimony is true. Or it starts in 3 John. And he goes into affirm our testimony is true by confirming somebody else. 2nd and 3rd John use the our. 1 John says that which we have touched, that which we have seen, the word of life. So you have that group again. We know from the Muratorian fragment that the Gospel of John was not John's idea. It was actually a group of bishops and surviving apostles who were still in Ephesus, and one of them's named in the Muratorian fragment, that was Andrew. And it's ironic that Andrew is on the scene before Peter ever was on the scene in that gospel with the unknown disciple, the unnamed disciple whom Jesus loved. And it's ironic those are the two people in the Muratorian fragment who actually created the idea to put together the Gospel of John. So for me, when John, so the complexity of John is this. Somebody would say, well, John's a fisherman. He couldn't have written that well. Now, we'll get to that in a minute. But the thing is somebody has to deal with the fact that, yes, it is well put together, but it is also the simplest vocab of any of the gospel writers, far simpler than Luke. In fact, if you take a Greek class in seminary, you don't start in Luke. You start in John. You start with the simple after your first year of vocab, you can translate the entire first chapter of John easily. But yet it's complex in its style and put together. Well, if he's in Ephesus, like pretty much everybody said he was, then you have the complexity of having professional scribes with an authority giving you the terms and the witness with simple terminology, complex writing. You have professional scribes with a simple man telling the story. You can mince those two things and understand, well, that's why John has simple vocab, but complex writing. So but it would have been a group. It would have been telling Andrew's story. It's John's story. It's others that did not get a speaking part in the other three gospels. So I think that there's multiple explanations as to the we. The we could be the group of Johannine disciples is what I call them. The same ones that wrote 1 John. I think the penman of 2nd and 3rd John is different from the Gospel of John because it says we know his testimony is true in John's gospel. You go to 3rd John, it says we know our testimony. So you got to wonder if that was a different penman, but the same group. My point is there's multiple explanations to the plurality of the we, us, and our, then going into the singularity. If the main eyewitness was John the Apostle, but he was also surrounded by others, you could understand why there would be a we and an I when point blank mentioned the guy that was supposed to live to the end of the ages.
Yeah, I think as far as 2124 appears to express the perspective of a group of people who are placing their approval upon the document. Again, the whole point of this verse is that the group is expressing approval of a book that goes from the beloved disciple who wrote these things
Yes.
down. I mean, that's what
he's the
saying.
star witness.
Yeah. So.
Mm-hmm.
And he should be. He was with Jesus in the inner circle, and he was at the cross when others weren't. He was there at the trial when Peter ended up running off. He's the only one left that actually saw major events that the others were not there for. His testimony mattered.
Yep.
Anything else you guys want to hit on that one?
I think we can continue.
Okay.
Believe that the entire last chapter of John was a later scribal addition. This is entirely possible, as the first manuscript to record John 21 is dated around 200, and even then ends with verse 17. Of course, it's possible the end was cut off, but even still, that manuscript contains evidence of first, second, and third-hand scribal corrections. Also regarding the end of John's gospel.
Do we want to stop there? Or
Sure.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Steve.
Well, I mean, that he just said it. I mean, he just said it. We don't have. It's a fragment. We don't have the whole
Exactly.
I mean, there's other sections missing of earlier gospels. We don't have the complete form of that. That doesn't mean these other stories in Luke that aren't there are not a part of that manuscript. I mean, like that's the point. There's no point in even using that as an argument. If you're in a engaging people on a subject matter that could be either or, there's really no point in even using it at that. If you have other literature, bring that into the equation. But that one right there, just on that statement, just excuse it. I mean, there's no point in even using that argument.
Yeah. I was confused why I even used it. It means nothing. It doesn't support us. It ends in verse 17. I mean, no one thinks that the rest of John 20 was added later. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so do you want me to keep going, or do we want to hit on?
Did you want to say something there, Eric?
No. Keep going, because he's going to get to a point.
Yeah.
I can address here.
Let me know when you want me to pause then.
Yeah, go ahead. I'll.
Well, writing in the year 208, Tertullian says, "And wherefore does the conclusion of the gospel affirm, and these things were written, unless it is that you might believe, and says that Jesus Christ is the Son of God," which describes the end of chapter 20, not 21. Just look at how chapter 20 ends. In response to doubting Thomas requesting to feel the holes in Jesus' hands, Jesus says, "Because you have seen me, have you now believed? Blessed are they who did not see and yet believe." The chapter concludes in the next two verses. "So then many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." Sounds like a fitting end to a gospel, but wait, there's more. Because then Peter goes fishing. Then the chapter concludes, "But there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I expect that even the world itself would not contain the book that was written." Now, as for Luke claiming to have gotten his information from
Yep.
We'll get back to Luke in a second here. So there's big problems here. Dapple says this is where John ends his gospel as far as Tertullian knows. And he quotes against Praxeus, I think it was chapter 25. He needs to read Tertullian a little bit more because he very clearly alludes to verse 21-23 in A Treatise to the Soul, chapter 50. He basically quotes it, "Even John underwent death, although concerning him there had prevailed an ungrounded expectation that he would remain alive until the coming of the Lord." Well, that's very clearly referring to the passages that we were just reading. Tertullian also seems to allude to John 21:19 when he writes, "And then Peter is girt by another." This is Scorpius chapter 15. And so seems pretty clear that he's referring to, where he says that, "Hey, Peter, you're going to be girt about by another, and you're going to go where you don't want to go." And so those are two passages that are pretty strong allusions, I think, that Tertullian is definitely quoting the 21st chapter. Also, the internal evidence speaks against it. Andreas Kostenberger, in his commentary of John, notes that the terminological similarities between chapter 1 and the rest of the gospel, these include similar language for taking and distributing bread, comparing 21:13 to the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 6, the use of the Sea of Tiberias, which is something that only John in his gospel uses. It's in chapter 21, and also we see it in chapter 6, verse 1. The double amen that's used over and over again. Leon Morris, in his book Studies on the Fourth Gospel, adds this fact that the narrator in John refers to Peter throughout his gospel as Simon Peter, or Peter, while Jesus himself calls him Simon, or Simon the son of John, which we see in 21:15 through 17. You can compare that with chapter 1, verses 42. And so not only is he false about what Tertullian says, but the internal evidence speaks against it. And there were other church fathers writing around the same time of Tertullian, like Clement of Alexandria, who are also quoting John chapter 21. The Clement, the instructor, book 1, chapter 5, he talks about them standing on the shore, saying to the disciples, they happened to be fishing, and he called aloud, "Children, do you have any meat?" Well, that's a clear allusion to chapter 21. And so, I don't think this one works at all.
Yeah. Well, building on what, go ahead, Daniel.
I was just going to say this because somebody that's watching this is probably just going to be like, well, where's the citation? So I'm just pulling up Tertullian chapter 50, the treatise on the soul thing here. And I have highlighted, once I share my screen, the quote from John 21 here, where it says, even John underwent death, although concerning him there had prevailed an underground expectation that he would remain alive until the coming of the Lord. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to quote that and show that, just so that way we can have our bases covered.
Well, when I first saw Dadpool make this statement, I was like, I mean, Richard Bauckham has a whole section on his book where he points out that this fits right in with what Tertullian's arguing, because Tertullian says, like, this is like the end of the gospel. Well, Bauckham is pointing out in his book that, yeah, that is the end of the main body of the gospel. And then chapter 21 is like an epilogue. 30 to 31, 21 to 24 to 25 form together a carefully composed two-stage conclusion of the gospel. This requires that written has the same sense in both 20 and 21. And Bauckham points to this. So he notes that John chapter 1 is like a prologue. John chapter 21 is like the epilogue. The last word in verse 23 are until I come. Contrast that with how he opens his gospel in the beginning. So you start out with going to the creation, and then you have the end referring to the Parousia. Then you see also the prologue of John's gospel has 496 syllables. The epilogue has 496 words. Now, the prologue is more poetic, so it's marked by syllables, whereas the ending is not written in a poetic structure, so it's marked by words. The two-stage conclusion of this gospel, again, 20 and 21, framing the epilogue, each consists of both 43 words in verses 20, 30 to 31, and 21, 24 to 25. Okay, odd coincidence unless you have an actual unity going on there. Okay, the first stage speaks of many other signs that Jesus did that are not included in this book, in addition to those signs that are not yet narrated. Then the second stage, which is chapter 21 of the conclusion, speaks more generally of many other things that Jesus did. So again, you have another dual structure there. Bauckham also notes that in one you see that so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, recalls the statement in the prologue about John the Baptist, who came as a witness to testify to the light so that many believe through him. So what Bauckham is doing is showing there's parallels between 21 and chapter 20, as well as parallels between the opening prologue of chapter 1 and chapter 21. And so when Tertullian says this is the conclusion of the gospel, that functions just fine with Bauckham's research, because, yeah, that is the conclusion of the main body. And then you have the epilogue, which is like additional. And Tertullian would have been familiar with this Greek style of writing about this dual ending structure that we see quite often.
Can I back up a little bit on the statement about P66? Because I actually just pulled up the manuscript.
Yep.
And P66 actually covers verses 1 through 9, verse 12, and verse 17 in chapter 21. Unless my eyes are absolutely deceiving me. It's fragmented. It's 1 through 9, verse 12 and verse 17. But his claim about P66 is probably wrong.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, I missed that. Yeah, you're right.
I'm actually looking at the manuscript right now because I actually have a database to the manuscript, and I'm looking at it, and they try to pin it on certain points.
Do you want to
see the first verse? Good luck trying to do that, man. I'll probably accidentally turn myself off here, but at the end of the day, people can look at it for themselves. I'm just making the point.
No.
The more we've been talking about this, I'm like, P66, I thought that goes toward close to the very end. And it actually has the first 9 verses and 2 more in that chapter. So I don't even think that statement's true from a textual. So, and I double check that, and everybody out there can double check me. But what I'm looking at right now in Greek is definitely verse 1 through 9. Just
Yeah, I am seeing that too. I missed that as well when I was preparing for this video. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
so there's that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Any other side?
No. You were
There's way more.
You were just doing the Billy Mays. You're like, but wait, there's more.
So also, I just want to say, Bauckham does point out that in a lot of Greek works, there was this dual kind of structure ending that we see with John's gospel. You know, like you do see this idea where there's an ending and then there's like an epilogue as well. So Tertullian would have been familiar with that style of writing. And so he could talk about 20 being the ending while there still being an epilogue.
Cool.
I think the fact that he keeps quoting chapter 21 is enough evidence.
All right. Moving on, guys.
Yeah. I think
okay, so let me back this up.
Talk about
Luke.
Darn autofocus.
Contain the book that was written. Now, as for Luke claiming to have gotten his information from eyewitnesses, there are problems with that as well, mainly in how the narratives surrounding Paul in Acts are so very different from his own firsthand accounts. It's important to keep in mind that Luke in Acts is written to one person, Theophilus, 40 to 50 years after the death of Jesus, while Paul is writing to a congregation of Christians 20 years after the death of Jesus. That makes these differences very important. In Acts, Paul has people with him when Jesus appears to him and blinds him. He has a dialogue with Jesus. Then Jesus appears to Ananias and tells him to go to Paul and restore his sight. And then Paul spends several days with the disciples before going to Jerusalem. One great example is Paul's conversion, which is recorded 3 times in Acts 9, 22, and 26. They're all very different from each other, but all 3 of them are very different from Paul's own account in Galatians chapter 1. Now in Galatians, again, Paul's own account, he doesn't say any of that. He says Jesus was revealed to him. That's it. There's no dialogue, no blindness, no Ananias. And contrary to Acts, saying that he spent several days with the disciples, Paul says he did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, both here and in 1 Corinthians 15. There are a lot of differences like those that cannot be reconciled without adding things to the text that wasn't previously there. If you have a legendary account that records demons and miracles on nearly every page, it doesn't matter who the author is claiming to have gotten his information from when you have multiple firsthand attestations of the same accounts that was written decades earlier that do not contain stories of the supernatural.
Richard Bauckham makes
you can pause it.
Yep.
Well, I'm gonna let you guys dive in a second, but I'll just say, well, there's a lot of things here. He discounts Acts because it has stories of miracles, and apparently Paul's letters don't. Paul frequently mentions his own miracles. He talks about he has the signs of the apostles. He talks about he traveled from Jerusalem to Illyricum. I'm probably saying that wrong. Doing miracles. There's the whole church of Corinth has all kinds of spiritual gifts and tongues and crazy things going on. He talks about miracles in Galatians chapter 3, verses 5. He's just making an argument from silence. Just because Paul is not going into details about his conversion and all the things that happened around it does not mean that we can conclude that it didn't happen. He's not writing an autobiography here. Okay. We have U.S. Grant wrote a daily, basically journal while he was in the Civil War. He doesn't mention the Emancipation Proclamation. It seems like kind of a big oversight, right? We got Grafton's Chronicles talks all about King John, but never mentions the Magna Carta. So the fact that he doesn't mention it is, again, just an argument from silence. And then just because there's supernatural things in the book of Acts doesn't automatically discredit it, because there's supernatural things also happening in Paul's own writings. He talks about going to the third heaven, for crying out loud. So, I mean, that's just incredibly weak, incredibly just not okay. Second of all, he talks about how there's contradiction between the accounts of Paul's conversion. Okay. Let me just have Bart Ehrman state the objection because he probably will state it a little more clearly. He says this emphatic statement that Paul is not lying should give us pause. He's completely clear. He didn't consult with others after his conversion, nor did he see his apostles for 3 years. And even then he did not take anyone except Cephas, Peter, and Jesus' brother James. This makes the account in the book of Acts very interesting indeed. According to Acts 9, immediately after Paul converted, he spent time in Damascus with the disciples, and he left the city and he headed into Jerusalem, where he met with the disciples. And so on all counts, this is Ehrman's conclusion here, Acts seems to be at odds with Paul. Did he spend time with the other Christians immediately in Acts, or did he not in Paul? Okay, so let's just look at the actual verses. Galatians 1:16 through 20. I was pleased to reveal his son, or Yeah, I was pleased for God to have revealed his son to me that I might preach him among the Gentiles. I didn't consult with anybody. I didn't go to Jerusalem. I didn't go, nor did I go up to Jerusalem with the other apostles before me. Excuse me there. But I went to Arabia and then returned to Damascus. And after 3 years, I went to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remain with him for 15 days. I saw none but the other disciples or the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. I'm writing to you, telling you the truth, guys. I didn't lie. Okay. Acts 9:23-25. When many days passed, the Jews plotted to kill him, but their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates day and night in order to kill him, but the disciples took him by night and let him down through a basket. And so this many days thing is where he's getting hung up at, right? But just how long is a period of many days? Well, could it be 3 years? I mean, it sure could be. I mean, if you look at 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 38-39, it said, and Shammai said to the king, what you say is good, as the Lord my king says, so will your servants do. So Shammai lived in Jerusalem for many days, but it happened at the end of 3 years that 2 of Shammai's servants ran away to Achish. And so many years actually could encompass many days can encompass 3 years. It's not really that much of a contradiction here. So what about the journey to Arabia? Well, Luke doesn't mention it, but that doesn't necessarily contradict Paul's story in Galatians. The trip may have happened within Luke's many days in 9:23, and Luke either just didn't know about it or didn't mention. You could quibble and say that Luke doesn't sound like he knew how long Paul waited before he went to Jerusalem, but Luke might simply be leaving out on important details and just focusing on Paul's apostolic call. Even if Luke wasn't exactly aware of the span of time, like, so what? One relatively unimportant detail doesn't show that he was unfamiliar with Paul's mission in life. There's tons and tons and tons of evidence that Luke was a traveling companion of Paul. If you read Colin Hemmer's book, there's 84 different minute details about all the travels of Paul that Luke gets right about ports, about religious customs, about local customs, local officials' names, and all kinds of different things like that. There's all kinds of other ways that the book of Acts and Paul's letters interlock with one another in casual, subtle, different ways that it doesn't look like he's copying from Paul's letters, but he's referencing things in Paul's letters that how would you know about unless you were a witness? And so you can't just take this like lame contradiction that's barely much of a contradiction at all. It really is no contradiction. And then just manufacture out of that Luke didn't really travel around with Paul.
Yeah, and I just want to add in the fact that he seems really resistant to harmonizations here. And I always just find it kind of a double standard because we do harmonization in everyday life when we do investigations in general. We do harmonizations when we do history, but then as soon as it comes to the Gospels, because it's religion, the automatic assumption is, oh, you're just harmonizing because of your religious like ideology. But it just seems like completely ridiculous to say we can harmonize over here, but as soon as you do it with the Gospels, it's bad. Yeah.
Well, I'll also add that Luke does time jumps. I mean, from at the end of his gospel, it's seen he jumps from the resurrection right to the ascension, and it seems like it's happening in the same day. But if you read the opening of Acts, there was 40 days where Jesus was appearing to his disciples in between the resurrection and the assumption, or the ascension, excuse me. So you have this idea that Luke does time jumps at times and just sort of keep the narrative going.
Yeah.
It would not be out of his question for do a narrative jump here as well.
Yeah. It's interesting too, in both stories, there's this mention of Damascus. Like Damascus isn't even really like something that's featured very much in the book of Acts. It's not very, very much talked about even in the epistles. And so it's kind of weird that like there's this small, subtle detail of Damascus that he adds there that I think also just kind of lends to the idea that this is something that's rooted in testimony versus just like invention.
And Luke seemed to be a really good historian when it came to how to give credit to his eyewitness person. Like if there's a story with people in it, he's telling you who's doing the talking and he gives them credit and will silence the other person. For example, on the 2 disciples on the road of Emmaus in Luke 24, you have Cleopas and the other is not mentioned. Though Cleopas is giving a statement affirming it, he silences the second individual who is speaking, but you never hear his name or his statement. It's just that they said these things, but it's only Cleopas that gets credit. The same thing happens later on in Acts. You have Peter and John both in Acts 2 at Pentecost and at the temple in Acts 3 at the Gate of Beautiful. And Peter and John said to them, then it quotes Peter every single time. John gets 0 speaking parts in Acts 2 and Acts 3. It just states that they said these things, but it's only Peter that's speaking. It's not John. Same thing happens later on when you go into the later part of Acts, when they're in Caesarea together. Paul and this we, us, our guy, who I think is Luke, sits at a table with Philip and his 4 daughters. Doesn't mention their names, mentions Philip's name. Why? Because if you go back to chapter 8, he has an entire narrative about a man named Philip who was in Samaria, who was carried out into the desert, ran into the Ethiopian eunuch, and there, reading Isaiah 53 scroll, ended up sharing Jesus with him from Isaiah 53. Boom, he disappears out of his sight. Well, it's like, well, where would a historian who is not out in the desert hearing the conversation get that from? Oh, that same Philip, he was in his house eating dinner with him later in the book. But notice that he gives Philip credit for the conversation and who is a part of it, but he doesn't mention the daughters of Philip. But he does that all throughout. If you just take your time and go through Luke and look at the names that he mentions the conversations, who the speakers are and who aren't. The speaking people are always the people giving credit. The silenced people are a part of the discussion, but never get a speaking part. It's consistent all through Luke. It's consistent all through Acts. So he was actually telling you who his eyewitnesses were, and he was reporting them like a good historian would, because they didn't have footnotes. They didn't have endnotes where you can say, well, I'm quoting so-and-so here, and I'm going to put foot number 2 and endnote number 3, whatever. He would silence the one that didn't give him the information, mention there was somebody else there, but only quote and only name the one who is giving him the information. That's what a good historian does.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, and this is kind of just where I'd plug in Hemmer's book on Acts, and Luke just gets so much right that's even independent of Josephus. Like, just kind of adding on to what you're saying, Stephen. He gets so much stuff right that's not dependent on Josephus. That just lends. Go ahead.
Well,
let me.
Well, I have a couple of examples from Hemmer's book that I think are pretty noteworthy. So he uses the plural anthropotoi in 1938, which is referring to a local official there, which is either a remarkable coincidence of expression or else a deliberate reference to the fact that at that very precise time, in the fall of AD 54, there were 2 men conjointly exercising the functions of a proconsul because of their predecessor, Silanus, had actually been murdered. And we can cross-reference this in Tacitus Annals 13:1, Dio Cassius 61:6-4, 61. It's just in there. I'm not going to give the precise reference unless people really want it, and you can ask for it in the comments. But I mean, that's just like one tiny detail of something that was only something that happened at that particular precise time, that Luke gets absolutely right. There's another one that's kind of interesting with the whole shipwreck of St. Paul. There's a little island called Cauda that Ptolemy and I think it was Pliny the Elder get the location of this tiny little island off the coast of, I want to say, I'm trying to remember the exact location of where Cauda is, but anyway, Luke is the only person who gets it right. That's what I'm trying. That's the point that I'm trying to make is Pliny the Elder are way off, and Ptolemy is way off, and he's a noted geographer. But the only person who actually gets the correct location is Luke, and so this makes the most sense if like he actually had been blown by the wind there himself, and even the amount of time that it took for them to get there was, I think it's in the Acts, it's like 14 days or 13 days or 14 days. And that's when they get there. It's around that same period of time. And we know that there is a 20 miles west-southwest wind through that area. That's just something that we know from meteorological data. And so it's like, how do you get stuff like that right? Unless these are things you experienced. You know?
And something else you brought up, Eric, was the amount of detail after chapter 16 where the we, us, our guy shows up. There is no doubt. And actually, I have engaged multiple conversations with atheists on Luke and Acts, and they will concede the reality that the details heighten after the we, us, our guy shows up in chapter 16. Like you gave multiple examples, and just to add to the list, the inscription on ships, the number of sailors on that ship. I'm actually of the persuasion, and I'm not willing to have my head chopped off for this, that Luke was actually a ship doctor. I think that he was actually a part of voyages and was a available physician for people in long distance travels. Because there's not just his knowledge of medical terms, which I'm sure we'll get into, but his ability to understand location, his ability to understand how ship porting and deporting works is quite fascinating. Because he has the details down, he has certain inscriptions down, locations, stopping points, certain ports that were pickup medical facilities of their day, where obviously they were stopping to get refreshments for food because it was a very marketed area versus one that is picking up medical supplies, which maybe we can get into that too. But as we go through, but to me, once the We Us Our guy shows up, it is immediately heightened in the amount of details are showing up there. I've actually had an atheist tell me, hey, Stephen, there's no doubt whoever showed up there was a true companion of Paul. I just don't think it was Luke. It's like, well, who else could it be? I mean, process of elimination. There's really nobody else we can list. I mean, but he's able to at least recognize there's definitely somebody traveling with Paul because of the amount of details that actually heighten after he shows up.
Yeah. And it's funny, just real quick thing that I'll throw in there. It's all the gospel writers call the Sea of Galilee. They call it Sea of Galilee, but Luke's just like, the lake, it's the like lake. Dude, this ain't no sea. Yeah, because it's obviously a lot smaller than this stuff that he's been traveling in. So
anyway. Yeah, especially for where he's from. That's exactly right.
All right, are we ready to move on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Convincing case, the Gospels are based on eyewitness accounts.
And there's nothing within the text that says anything remotely close to, hey, this is Matthew writing this.
It was very common in the culture of that time period to write about yourself in third person. We see both Xenophon and Josephus doing this.
Now, I'm not going to pretend I've read everything written in and around the 1st century, but I have read quite a lot. And I wouldn't say it's very common. And while I'm not sure exactly how many times Josephus switches to the third person, I can say that the vast majority of his writings are in the first person. Here's a random passage from the Jewish War in chapter 11. Titus Caesar persuaded me frequently to take whatever I would. I thought nothing else to be of any value which I could take. I made this request to Titus. I had also the holy books. I asked of him the life of my brother. I also went once to the temple. I got all those that I remembered. I delivered them. I was sent by Titus Caesar, and as I came back, I saw many crucified. I was very sorry of this in my mind. You don't see anything like that in the Gospels.
Can we pause there for a minute? It says,
yeah, please.
So actually a 17-year-old high school girl in my class that I teach apologetic. I teach 2 apologetic type classes at a high school here in South Carolina. And one of the girls pointed out the fact that Michael, he didn't answer any of the 2 quotes you posted. Mm-hmm, this is one of the parts where somebody paused me and say, well, wait a minute. He showed Josephus quote and Xenophon quote in addition to other quotes to go reference. And it was like, well, I don't think this was common. Let me show you where Josephus actually used first person. We didn't say he didn't use first person. Michael, I don't remember any point in there where you said Josephus always used third person. Like, I don't remember you ever saying that. And a 17-year-old high schooler actually pointed this out. They're like, wait a minute. He actually never answered Michael's 2 posts of the quotes you have up there. He just went to another. So the question that I would ask here in a polite way is like, what about the ones where he doesn't? Because that's what Michael posted. What about Xenophon? And there's many more. Caesar, go read the writings of Caesar. Caesar often called himself Caesar, him going into this battle, meeting this person. Like, this is a Greco-Roman thing. And it's, and here's the problem. We've conflated categories too. It's like, when did this most often happen? Not in autobiographies as much. It's more biographical, or if it's about somebody else, the person gives polite precedence to either another individual or a leader or a war or a general. And you start talking in the third person out of preference for them because you're trying to give them credibility. It's about them, not about you. So you do see where Josephus goes back and forth, but you got to read the sections where he does that. It was strategic. Same thing with Xenophon. Xenophon's talking about, Xenophon. And Xenophon, he wasn't a soldier. He wasn't. It's like, well, why is he talking about himself like that? This was a proper way of giving precedence to the person he was about to address. And so he says, I haven't read a lot, or he said he read a lot, but you need to read a lot more, I would say there. And I mean that respectfully, because this was not uncommon. This isn't like a small thing. This happens all over the place in Greco-Roman writing. And I don't like that he dodged your quotes and just ripped up another Josephus quote that we would all say, well, yeah, of course he did that. It's like, it was kind of like a bait and switch a little bit to me. I don't know. That bothered me.
No, to me it was whataboutism. Well, what about this? Well, it doesn't disparage the fact that we see Thucydides, Xenophon, Polybius, Julius Caesar, as you mentioned, Josephus, all these guys writing about themselves in third person.
Yeah.
And I was going to note, but you said it better than I could have. In autobiography work, you would see more first person, but in biographical work, you see more third person. So that's what we would expect from the Gospels, because these are about Jesus, not about John or Matthew or Luke.
Yeah.
And the moments that they become about one of the disciples, like in John 21, specifically talking about a statement made about him, what does the author do? He pulls out of the third person for a minute and mentions a first person. I'm writing this to you. I'm telling you that interpretation is wrong because I'm the one telling you this. He does it when it becomes a claim, not about Jesus anymore, but a claim about him. And that is a perfect illustration in John 21, where this consistency goes of the biography. But the minute there was a claim about the disciple laid on Jesus's breast, he puts himself into the text, changes format, goes to first person, and then they drop back out and say, and we know his testimony is true, third person. That's a perfect example, is John 21.
I think Augustine probably would have been more familiar with the literature than probably Captain Dadpool and had read it a lot more. And he debunked this argument really like 1600 years ago, because the only time this came up was with the Manichaean Faustus for the first 400 years that we at least have record of. And I'll just read the quote real quick because it's pretty top gangsta here. But he says, Faustus thinks he's himself wonderfully clever in proving that Matthew is not the writer of his gospel, because when speaking of his own election, he writes not, he saw me, said to me, follow me, but he saw him, spoke to him, follow me. This must have been said in ignorance or with the intent to mislead. Faustus can hardly be so ignorant as to have not read or heard that narrators, when speaking of themselves, often use a construction as if speaking of another. It is more probable that Faustus wished to bewilder those more ignorant than himself in hope of getting a hold of a few not acquainted with these things. And so I'll let the watchers kind of decide about that. I think Captain Dadpool just probably needs to read some more literature, because it sounds like he's unfamiliar. I'm not saying that he's just trying to pull the wool over people's eyes, but again, we got Herodotus, Thucydides, Livy, Xenophon, Polybius, Tacitus does this, Suetonius does this, Nicholas's History, Dexippus Scythica, excuse me. And so you mentioned Caesar, and so
it's a long list.
This argument, just if I were just an atheist and I was trying to rag on the Gospels, just let this one go. Just let this one pass. I know it's tempting. I know it's real tempting. It's shiny and it sounds persuasive, but it's just bad. It's just bad atheist apologetics.
In fact, that's one of the things. So the literature starts changing not long after that. And one of the things that you know about the Gnostic Gospels, for example, or those that were not of the canonical Gospels, we start getting the Gospel of Peter, which I've published my own translation of. When you look at the Gospel of Thomas, look at the Gospel of Mary, they are admittedly calling themselves by their name and first person, saying that they're writing. Those should have been indicators immediately that these are faulty Gospels. These are not eyewitness reports, because they left the eyewitness strategy of writing the way that we're talking about and spent their whole Gospels in the first person, not just sections, the whole Gospels. I mean, at the very end of the Gospel of Peter, right where the fragment breaks off of the manuscript, the only manuscript we have of it, it says, I, Simon Peter, and my brother Andrew went with Levi, blank, blank. That's the end of the manuscript. Then he includes himself in the resurrection narrative when he's not even there. So he puts himself in the first person with the women at the tomb. I, Thomas, Didymus. I mean, he goes in like Mary, calling herself Mary. This isn't all we should be concerned when we see Gospels who don't practice that kind of thing. And it's ironic that only the canonical use that form and all the other ones use first person.
It's interesting with this contrast, because when you see like you just said, with the whole things where they're talking in the third person, they're not referring to themselves, contrasted with the apocryphal Gospels. But then you also see when they do use, like we mentioned earlier about locations and local officials and different things like that, about all they get is like Pilate, Herod, the high priest. They don't even mention his name. They're not mentioning the minute the real, these subtle kind of casual small details that are like something that you really need to know. They're just getting easy stuff right. You know what I'm saying? And so it's interesting that like the ones who are anonymous have way more historical information than the ones who are put in somebody's name, but it's just like they don't mention, there's nothing historically confirmable that isn't like something that you could just guess because they're just things that everybody would know. So yeah, right. It's just
and you got to wonder, Eric, like how much in like, so these are arguments from outside the text. Then you go into the text. It's like, but what would prove an eyewitness within a text? And this is something that Bauckham really does a good job on, and so does Bird. Mm-hmm. But there are reasons to believe the eyewitness, like that Peter is actually behind Mark's gospel. I mean, you find him doing all the speaking on behalf of the group. When the group is being addressed by Jesus, Peter is explicitly the one. And then you find a combination of both. When Peter understands something, the whole narrative changes. When he misunderstands something, the whole narrative changes. He's speaking on behalf of everybody. His involvement in gaining knowledge of something, it's telling you his feelings, it's telling you his emotions, it's telling you his memory, it's telling you things. Like all of a sudden, and then you get into the inclusio eyewitness format, which was not just unique to the Gospels, where who's the first name, last name of the book? Who's the first one that shows up on the scene as a major eyewitness and who is not? You start finding that different from John over to Mark. Mark starts out with Peter. It ends with, tell my brothers and Peter, ending with Peter is the last one that's addressed. And then you go into John, and who's the last one there? It's not Peter. All of a sudden, it ends with the disciple that was on Jesus's breast is the last one mentioned. He's also the first one anonymously mentioned with Andrew. So you see even how John and Mark are both using the same kind of inclusio eyewitness situation, just on their who actually was there. Because you just read Mark, it's like, well, Peter must have been one of the first ones that Jesus called. Then you actually hear John's side of it. He was there before, and it was Andrew that went and told Peter about Jesus. But why did Mark not tell us what? Because he wasn't there. He wasn't there with John and Andrew when he first met Jesus. He came after the fact. So, but you see styles of writing. I know that Bauckham, somewhere in his book, mentions Cuthbert Turner back in like the early 1900s, demonstrated that there was something called a plural to singular narrative device in Mark's gospel. And I think there was 21 usages where without an explicit subject, just a continuation, the movement of Jesus in the verb, all of a sudden everybody's there. And then it's just Jesus talking. And then all of a sudden it goes right into Peter, only Peter being like, there's so many devices in literature style that I wonder how much people sit down and actually observe before they come to these dogmatic positions and say, oh, these are not eyewitness. They don't claim to be eyewitnesses. They're using the third person. It's like, okay, well, let's back up. Let's make that the last case scenario. Let's actually get into the text, see if we can find literature devices, narrative devices that are consistent, A, with the time, B, does it demonstrate possible eyewitness and connected to a name in the text to being that eyewitness? You can play that out with John. You can play that out with Peter. You will find Peter is behind Mark every single time. He's the only one talking out of the whole entire group. And at the end of the day, you'll find that for John, and it seems like Andrew being a part of that as well. But anyway, that's something that just bugs me. It's like we're so surface level on that. It's like there's way more to it than just those things.
Yeah.
Anything else, guys?
No, we should probably continue.
All right, let's go.
They were written by Jesus' disciples. You most certainly would. That's how literature worked in the ancient world. If you were someone who had any authority in the subject you're talking about, you wanted your audience to know that. Look at how Paul addresses his letters. I, Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, do say to you. And look how many people pretended to be Paul, having the similar introduction to those letters. That's how that worked. The authors remained anonymous because they wanted to remain anonymous. Period.
Moreover, within 150 years of when the Gospels were written, we have multiple authors all unanimously in agreement that the four Gospel authors were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
So Irenaeus' book Against Heresy is written roughly about 185 CE. This is the first time we see the Gospels mentioned as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, with the possible exception of the Muratorian fragment, which I'll get to in a minute. But anyway, he says, it is not possible that the Gospels can either be fewer or more in number than they are. For since there are 4 zones in all the world that we live and 4 principal winds, while the church is scattered throughout all the world. At their time, there was about 70 Gospels in circulation, but Irenaeus insisted on only using 4. In Tertullian's apologetic against Marcion, he says, of the apostles, therefore John and Matthew first instill faith into us, while the apostolic men, Luke and Mark, renew it afterwards. He makes his book easy to date because he says he's writing the 15th year of the reign of King Severus, which is approximately 208, 20 years after Irenaeus names them. Now, the Adumbrations in Epistolis Canonicus on 1 Peter 5:13 is written by Clement of Alexandria, who lived between 150 and 215. Early in his life, he went on a very long spiritual journey where he traveled to Greece, Asia Minor, Palestine, and Egypt, where he studied under a few different theologians until he arrived in Alexandria in 180. There he studied under Pantaenus and was ordained to the priesthood by Pope Julian before 183. Prior to leaving Alexandria in 203 as a result of Severian persecution, Clement wrote 3 letters. The passage in question is found in the first, the Prostus Septicus, which says, "These things are written in the gospel according to Mark, and likewise in all the other gospels. Correspondingly, although the expressions may vary slightly in each gospel, they all show identical agreement in meaning." This text is using 1 Peter 5:13 to support his claim, but the problem is, not only is Mark never mentioned in the gospels, but the verse in particular says that Mark is the author's son. Now, the Muratorian fragment is a Latin translation of a Greek composition. The manuscript itself is dated to about the 7th or 8th century, but the majority of scholars do think the text was written somewhere around the 2nd century, or the end of the 2nd century, roughly around the time of Irenaeus. It is entirely possible that it's written prior to Irenaeus, but even if so, it wouldn't have been by very much. Now, Papias wrote a 5-volume work called The Expositions of the Sayings of the Lord, not Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and none of them survived. What we know about his work comes from quotations from Irenaeus and Eusebius, but it's believed that he would have been writing somewhere between the year 110 and 130. Papias tells us that he prefers oral tradition over written texts, so rather than copying something, he interviewed people and recorded what they said. This means he is the first known author to collect the sayings of Jesus. But the reason his writings didn't survive is because he fell out of favor with the church for holding a view called Chaelism, which is a literal interpretation of the 1,000-year reign of Christ.
That's not
was
true.
Called naive, dangerous. And Eusebius says that Papias affirms that he received the sayings of the apostles, but he's writing in the year 320.
Their educations were in.
You can pause it.
We should stop there. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff there. But
there's a lot of, I was confused on this whole section because is he trying to argue that they're all wrong on this? I'm confused because that's a very bold statement to make if that's what he's trying to do.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised. So he said that, well, Papias interviewed people and became the first collection of the sayings. Well, no, he interviewed eyewitnesses.
Mm-hmm.
The big difference here. He didn't just interview people. He interviewed 2 eyewitnesses that he mentioned, John the Elder and Aristion, and I believe there is a distinction, John the Apostle. He was under John the Apostle. Irenaeus talks about that a little bit. To my knowledge, he was never removed from anything because of his belief on the 1,000-year reign. He was a faithful bishop in Hierapolis all the way to the day that he died. He was criticized later by Eusebius for his belief on the 1,000-year reign being literal instead of figurative. But he wasn't kicked out or excommunicated or anything of the sort on the basis that he believed that. Again, Eusebius criticized him, but we're talking about 200 years later. So I'm not sure where he's getting that, but it's not just that he knew people. It's like these people you're listing go back to sources. They're in different portions of the world where apostles started churches. John Mark, after Peter was executed, went down to Egypt. So any tradition that's down there with Clement or Origen or the oral tradition of Didymus the Blind, anything that comes from down there is actually coming from the Coptic churches. These are apostolic churches started by apostles. Irenaeus was trained under the ministry of Polycarp, who was trained by John the Apostle himself. Ignatius writing about things under John's things. Clement of Rome, we have an entire epistle to him, trained by Peter and Paul. We're not just talking about some random ideas that people have across the world. We're talking about, he said there's roughly 70 gospels at this point. I don't know where he got that number at all.
I don't know either.
But as, again, one of my students pointed out, one of my high school students pointed out, isn't it ironic that the same 66 keep getting rejected in every single location in the world? Because he mentioned multiple people. He mentioned Papias. He mentioned Clement. He mentioned the Muratorian fragment. And there's more than that. I mean, we can keep going with this. I mean, there's way more than that. Tertullian's in North Africa. He went from Rome to North Africa. You had Irenaeus, who was in the east, that ended up going closer down toward modern-day France today. You have the Muratorian fragment. You also have the Anti-Marcion Prologue. I mean, you have other documentation that are dealing with this in Rome and in Western Europe. And then you've got the Syriac, then you got translations with the Gospels in the set, like the Peshitta. I mean, then you have Coptic fragments in the 2nd century. You've got early attestation from church fathers and patristic writers and ancient translations in Ethiopia. I mean, isn't it ironic that the same 4 Gospels, not 3, not 5, not 4 of a different setup, a different lineup, the same 4 Gospels were in every single location where the apostles had spread, and the same ones are rejected. These people didn't have Skype. They didn't have YouTube Live. They didn't have the opportunity to get on the phone or send an email and say, hey, guys, just so you know, we've accepted these. We're rejecting these. How is it that before Nicaea, the same 4 Gospels are the only 4 Gospels used in any language, any section, any patristic, any church father quote in the world? It's what a coincidence, right?
Yeah. Well, if you want to share my screen, Than, I just want to pull up Simon Gathercole's 2019 paper.
Yep.
Where he argued, it's the paper is the alleged anonymity of the canonical Gospels. And he just goes through, look at all these different sources, all confirming unanimously that these are the 4 Gospel authors. We never see Matthew attributed to like Philip or like Mark say attributed to Andrew. It's always Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John every single time. And it's over and over again. And you see actually different traditions among the church fathers. For example, Clement of Alexandria thought that Matthew and Luke were written first, but Irenaeus seems to think it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So they disagree about the order, indicating there's different strands of tradition. In every one of those strands of tradition, though, it's always the 4 Gospel authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So Gathercole goes on and he argues, like, all of these, it doesn't matter if we're talking like 4th or 5th generations, they're all telling the same story. These are the 4 Gospel authors. Yeah. That is multiple attestation to this. You compare this with the book of Hebrews, they're debating about that, and they're not making, they're trying to figure out who it was. They didn't even question Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They knew it with these were the 4 Gospel authors. Mm-hmm. Hebrews, they were unsure, and they admitted it, and they were not entirely sure where it came from. If the Gospel were originally anonymous, and Gathercole argues extensively against that they were actually never really anonymous, we should see them being treated more like Hebrews. But Gathercole goes through his paper and notes that it was probably more likely they always came with a title, because this is what we see with a lot of biographies. He does a survey of all the biographies, the ancient world, and all but 2 are basically anonymous in the body of the text. They only come with a title that telling us who the author is. Mike Lacona notes that for example, you take Plutarch's Lives, they don't identify them. We only know that from a title. And what we have is about a century or so later, we have the Lab Press catalog. Tell us that Plutarch's son wrote the Lives. Compare Plutarch's Lives to all this attestation for the Gospels. No one doubts that Plutarch wrote his biographies here, even though we have like one later attestation that even gets the attestation wrong, attributing it to his son. But look at all the stuff we have for the Gospels. Why would we doubt that when we're not doubting Plutarch?
Yeah, it's a double standard. And another thing too, even though Justin Martyr, he never like names them. He said like not until Irenaeus. Well, Justin Martyr at least quotes all 4 of the Gospels. He calls them the memoirs of the apostles and those who followed them. Well, that certainly describes what we have. Then he had a student named Tatian who put together a harmony of the Gospels, and it starts with, in the beginning was the Word was with God. It's a harmony of John and the Synoptic Gospels. And so it's just like we already have at least strong clues of this early attestation even before we even get to Irenaeus. So, and I mean, again, even this list here, it's earlier than Irenaeus in some of them.
And most would agree that the Didache is in the 1st century. I would place it toward the end. Some would go earlier than that. I personally wouldn't. Didache quotes Matthew's gospel almost 29 times.
Yeah,
I mean, based on my doctoral research, I came up with the number 29, 4 of which could be disputed, 25 are not disputed. They were either fragmented or full-fledged statements. It also quotes from Luke's gospel and 1 from Mark. Then you go into Clement of Alexandria. Again, 1st century. He quotes Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Ignatius quotes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all 4. All of these guys, and it's not just the date, it's the quality of the person doing the quoting, because these are people who are actually with the eyewitnesses. Papias knew of the 4 Gospels. He talks about Papias as if he was just collecting sayings of Jesus, if it was original to him. But Papias goes on to explain how Mark came into existence and how Matthew came into existence, he was clearly familiar with John's gospel, because the mention of the disciples that he gives as his sources of checking or appear in the exact order they show up in John's gospel. He also uses, I would add that Papias was familiar with Luke, because he uses the opening of Luke for his opening. So he clearly knew of the 4 gospels, but again, it's not just the date of the guy. It's like, well, he was 110 probably when he was writing. Doesn't matter. He knew John. He was with the apostles. He knew eyewitnesses, Ignatius and Clement and Polycarp. Polycarp's epistle to the Philippians, he quotes Matthew. He quotes Mark. He quotes Luke. The only one he doesn't quote is John, which is interesting. He was trained by John, but he does quote 2 John. But anyway.
Quotes 1 John too.
But it's debated if it's 1 John or 2 John there. I actually lean with it as 2 John, because the word connection is, I'd have to show you on my graph in my dissertation. But either way, he quoted 1 John or 2 John, just not the Gospel of John. But what's ironic about that, their goal in writing these epistles wasn't like, how many canonical books can we fit into a single epistle? Let's quote as many as possible. They're just instructing these churches with what they have as authoritative. Even though they are bishops, they are using authoritative texts that are greater. You even see in Polycarp's epistle, he appeals to Paul's authority in the book of Philippians. He tells the church, like, hey, you have a copy of the letter that he wrote to your church. Read it, and in reading it, you will grow your faith. He assumed they still had that letter. B, he assumed that letter had supernatural ability to grow faith. So they saw these letters, these writings already as authoritative and spiritual development in these early guys. But it's not about the date. It's about the association and who they were and who they knew.
Yeah.
But again, it's all 4.
I'll mention real briefly, because I've heard this really bad argument before. So just in case somebody brings it up, like Clement of Rome, they're like, oh, well, he only mentions, he quotes these people, but he doesn't cite, like, give the citations or anything else like that, and say I'm quoting Matthew's gospel or something like that. Well, he quotes the Old Testament over and over and over again, and he's not saying Jeremiah and Isaiah and Moses said either. So, like, just don't come back with that one. Just heading that one off at the pass.
Agreed.
Anything else, guys?
No, I think we can move on.
Okay.
I don't think we're going to make it.
Well, we got it. We're almost there.
So maybe they were literate, maybe they were semi-literate, but they definitely didn't know Greek, which is the language that the Gospels were written in.
This is speculation. The church fathers say Mark was the interpreter of Peter, so it's likely he knew Greek.
Again, this is Papias, and he states that he personally talked with Christians who had known a group of people he called the elders, who had known some of the disciples. And this is what the elders had to say. When Mark was the interpreter of Peter, he wrote down accurately everything that he had recalled of the Lord's words and deeds, but not in order, for he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But later, as I indicated, he accompanied Peter, who used to adapt his teachings to the needs at hand, not arranging, as it were, an orderly composition of the Lord's sayings. So quick recap, Irenaeus is quoting Papias, who says he spoke with Christians who knew the disciples, and they that Mark was the interpreter of Peter. And if my math is correct, I think that would make this a fifth-hand account.
What?
Luke was a trained physician.
Did you want to say anything on that, or keep going?
Well, Papias did say that he was an interpreter of Peter. Irenaeus said, wherefore also Mark the interpreter and followed Peter. Tertullian, Mark was the interpreter of Peter. Clement of Alexandria, Mark wrote Peter's teaching while Peter was alive. Origen, according to Paul's instructions, Mark wrote the second gospel. Anti-Marcionite prologue, he himself was the interpreter of Peter. Jerome, Mark was a disciple and interpreter of Peter. It's not just Papias. It's not just Papias. They all said he was an interpreter of Peter.
And again, Papias didn't just interview random people. He showed no interest in anonymous community traditions. He wanted to talk to eyewitnesses. He talked to disciples of the Lord, as he said. This was not coming from just random church people he found. This was, he wanted to interview the living witnesses.
This is a quote. I think it's Tertullian quoting Papias, and he says, and whenever anyone came who had been a follower of the elders, I asked about their words. What Andrew or Peter had said, and the Greek word he used here is ipin, which is past tense, or Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew or any of the other Lord's disciples, and what Aristion and the presbyter John, disciples of the Lord, were still saying. And a Greek word there is legusin, which is present tense. So like Papias collected this stuff while these people were still alive.
Yeah, he used the aorist in one sense and present active in the other. And
Yeah,
so, he was definitely, that's a great point, then. That's a great point. The
Anything
living
else,
and
guys,
abiding voices.
Does he talk about the disciples not speaking Greek later, or is this the only part?
I think it's later.
I think
does he do it twice?
Okay. We'll wait. We'll wait on that.
Yeah.
Eric's like, I'm
So he probably knew Greek. Matthew, being a tax collector, kept records, so it's likely he also understood the language.
So the only verse that claims that Luke was a physician is Colossians 4:14, which is one of the epistles that scholars don't even think was written by Paul. And if Luke was the author of Luke and Acts, why does he never mention himself being a physician? You may have heard that Luke was a companion of Paul, but he never identifies himself again as Luke.
Did you guys know that? Did you guys know that in some of Paul's epistles, he doesn't mention he's a Christian? He must not be a Christian.
Yeah,
he must not be a Christian because he doesn't mention he's a Christian. All right, so
we should wait. We should let it. We should
just go ahead.
Finish real quick. Yeah. The one thing I'll say is with the disputed letter of Paul thing. I think Paul, Eric, you made a video on that, right?
I made a video on the pastorals.
Okay.
But Stephen could probably even address this better than I can.
I sent. Yeah, go ahead.
No,
go
you go ahead because you're the. All right, that's fine. Basically, there was a. I think it's British.
I was just about to cite that.
Or something like that. They did a survey, and actually, Colossians is one that people are more up on as far as probably being Pauline, or at least them being uncertain. Than any other of the other questioned epistles. Like the pastorals are more questioned, but Colossians is one where a lot of people, it seems like a lot of scholars are thinking like they either don't know or they think it's very possible that Paul could write it. And so this is not like some sort of vast consensus of scholars that think that Colossians is some sort of forgery, like whatsoever. A lot of people think that Paul probably wrote it, and that's not just like Christian scholars. That's a pretty heterogeneous group there of different scholars from different stripes. So,
my friend Elijah Hickson, who wrote the book with Peter Gurry, Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism, is actually the one that sent me that list. So I want to make sure to give him credit for that. And this is a group of people in England that came together, scholars from all different kind of schooling out there, and they meet and have these discussions. And Pauline authorship was one of them. And you'd be surprised at how many people accept Colossians as Pauline. And you'd be surprised at how many people are starting to accept the pastorals, but that's another subject. But yeah, to make that statement is like, well, that's just kind of the consensus, or that's most people don't even accept that. It's like, but we actually have a database that we can show you where there was a real consensus taken. Where is that consensus at? That might be the highest opinion in your audience group, but that's not factual data where people actually sat down and voted on this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right, let's keep going so we can make time here.
Paul until later in his missionary journey. Starting in Acts 16, verse 10, we start seeing the we passages. We immediately sought to leave from Macedonia. They're waiting for us at Troas, but we went ahead of them. We took him abroad the day we came to Miletus. Of course, this doesn't mean Luke was not a physician. That would be an argument for silence. But even still, being a physician in the ancient world did not require being literate, nor did being a tax collector. But even if they were literate, I would have no problem granting that. But the problem is they still don't identify themselves as the author. So there's no reason to think that they are.
Also, I
mean, we've kind of already
we've
hammered that
already.
To death. Yeah.
The one thing I just really want to say there that's flawed is I don't think any of us would say that just because he's a physician or a tax collector, it doesn't like entail that they would be literate. We're just saying, given their occupation, there's a high likelihood that they would be literate. So,
well, and I'll also add that Loveday Alexander has argued that Luke's preface matches what we see in handbooks on medicine, mathematician, rhetorical theory from the ancient world. Daryl Schmidt argued that the conventions we see in Luke matches, or at least has influence from Hellenistic historiography. So it seems very likely that Luke would have been familiar with written works. We do see some evidence of markers of handbooks on medicine that you could see kind of parallels there.
Yeah.
Over and over and over again. I mean, his opening is many have undertaken to compile a narrative. He uses a Greek word epikreison there, which is from Hippocrates. Hippocrates' manual starts with, as many has undertaken, same exact line, same exact phrase, epikreison, to speak or to write concerning the healing art. He says concerning a narrative that's going to be compiled. He took Hippocrates' opening, stating that many have tried to heal through medicine and failed, and I'm going to give instruction as a better way. Luke takes that same example and says, many in my day are attempting to put a narrative together, but I'm going to do an excellent one, an orderly one, a perfect one. He's following the same opening that Hippocrates did in his healing manual. It's like, well, I never said in the beginning, I'm a physician, but he starts out like a physician. See, that's the thing here. Like you have to take that. So if he's not a physician, he either understands it. And by the way, that's the only time in the whole New Testament that word epikreison is used. Once in Luke, once in Acts. There's other things there too. Like who would forge under the name of Luke? Like if it's just an anonymous gospel, who would use Luke? I mean, if Paul didn't actually write Colossians, well, then take that one out. And if Second Timothy is not Paul, then take that one out. So then all you really have is Philemon, who mentions him, and he's no different than Demas. I mean, he's no more popular than Demas. The only reason Luke is famous is because the historians and the church fathers say he wrote a gospel. If we didn't have those quotes, we would have no weight on who Luke is. And then he has the audacity in the first chapter to sit there and admit, I'm not an eyewitness. I only interviewed the eyewitnesses. It's like, that's a horrible start to a forgery, buddy. Like, you're telling us you're not an eyewitness, and you're admitting that you're writing an account not based on personal eyewitness. And then people are putting Luke's name on it. This is the worst forgery ever. But kind of let me give you some physician-like instances in Luke and Acts, just if I could just bulletproof a few of them. Okay. He's the only gospel writer in Luke chapter 4 that takes a Greek proverb that teaches physician, heal yourself. Now, there's much dispute about where this originated from, whether it went back to Hippocrates or Galen or one of the others, or even some of the Greek plays that they were putting on at that time. But isn't it ironic that in Jesus' hometown event, the only person that actually records this, Matthew and him both record the temptation prior to it, but Luke is the only one that builds to this point where they're going to say, Jesus, prove yourself here like you did in Capernaum. And Jesus says, I know what you're going to say to me. You're going to use a proverb, not a proverb like a Hebrew proverb. It's actually a Greek proverb. Physician, heal yourself. Like, prove yourself that you're a healer by being the way you were in Capernaum. And so he's the only one that mentions that. Now, he's also the only one that mentions the fact that Mark has Peter's mother-in-law with a fever. He wants to go a little bit further than that. Like, he wants to diagnose this a little bit more specific. Same thing with the message of leprosy, full of leprosy or a high fever. It's like he's correcting, not in a contradictory way, but it's like, actually, how specific can we be on this? He's the only one that mentions 2 miraculous births. Matthew mentions 1. He mentions 2, an elderly couple through John the Baptist and Jesus being born of a virgin. He's the only one that has the audacity out of the 4 gospels that mention that a guy in the group took a sword, chopped off an ear of an unknown guy that John tells us later it was Peter and it was Malchus. But none of them report the fact that Jesus actually picked that ear up and actually healed the ear the way that it was done. He uses terminology with the woman who has a hunchback and the 18-year back condition in Luke 13. And he uses terms that is only used. Astheneos, for example, being disabled, uses a term for being straightened up. You're free of your disability. Suku, Topsu, or Tupsa, I believe is there. It's only a word used out of the ancient manuals for how to relax a tendon and a membrane in the back that Galen and Hippocrates uses. In the Good Samaritan, the regulation that Jesus told in this parable of how to bind a wound is play by play from Hippocrates and Galen, like how to anoint it with the wine for the alcoholic antiseptic kind of idea, and then putting the oils on it to wrap it a certain way. The Good Samaritan detail of how the Samaritan took care of the guy that was beat up is precisely the prescription and in order the way Galen and Hippocrates said to do it. Then you go over to Acts, and there's many more in Luke, but then you go over to Acts. You're on Malta. He's practicing medicine. These people are sick. He gives a description of this gastric fever that's going around. It's a medical term that he only talks about. Nobody else talks about it. He diagnoses the people's symptoms and gives it the exact, again, he was obviously clear with, very read up on Hippocrates. He was obviously a big fan of Hippocrates. He uses his manual for quite a bit. There are dozens and dozens of words that are only used in Luke and Acts that are attached to Hippocrates, Galen, and other ancient physicians. If this guy, like the word perplexed and zoagane and things like that in Acts 7, only Galen used that term that we know of in reference to prescribing something who's on the place of death. There are term after term after term that if this guy isn't a physician, he's a big fan of physicians and he's read a lot of physicians. So to me, he never said he's a physician, but it's like, that's one of those things where it's like, guys, let's back up. Like, let's walk through the text and see if we can actually find that out, because Jerome said Luke, the physician, as his writings indicate, and Jerome, being the Greek scholar that he was in Rome, recognized while translating the Vulgate, man, I have to go back to my classical Greek words over here to constantly translate what Luke's saying. Even Jerome, translating the Vulgate, realized I have to go back to ancient Greek doctors to translate him into Latin. So again, I think there's more to the story than a claim.
Awesome. Let's keep going. Awesome. That was really cool.
I would agree with Richard Bauckham that the author of the Gospel of John is not John the son of Zebedee, but who Papias called John the Elder. And there's no reason to doubt that he was educated.
I actually tend to think that the author of John's Gospel is even more educated than the other three. The other synoptic Gospels make geographic mistakes about the Sabbath, the Passover, and burial rituals. And John comes along.
Okay, so real quick, just gonna yes, read that book. Awesome work done there. I have a live stream with somebody named Bram Rawlings titled like Who Wrote the Gospels, and we tackle a lot of the stuff that Dad will like alludes to here as well. So just check that out. Anything you guys want to add in like really quick before we keep going?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
And sort of corrects all of them. Now, with that being said, John, the latest gospel, is about 95% unique from the other three gospels. It has a lot of information in it that's not anywhere in the other three. Also, let's not forget Acts 4:13. Now, as they observed the confidence of Peter and John and understood that they were uneducated and untrained men, they were amazed and began to recognize them as having been with Jesus. The Greek word there is agrammatori and literally means without letters. They could not read or write. So this highlights.
So,
well, just really quick. I mean, I know we disagree on this, but I mean, that really doesn't even respond to me, because I was arguing that it was John the Elder along with Richard Bauckham. The John, I believe in there, is John, son of Zebedee. It doesn't really even respond to my position here.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So the Greek word used in Acts 13 is agrammatos, and it means without learning or unlettered. And it means like it's not meant to actually mean like illiterate. We actually have even some papyri where these types of words are used to describe people that were actually writing things, and they still describe these people as illiterate even though they were writing things. Mm-hmm. So for instance, I can pull it up. And people that know anything about papyri will probably know what we're looking at here, but this is an example of one right here. The other thing I kind of wanted to bring up is, if I can get this stuff to work, it's hard to manage a stream at the same time as pulling up all my notes. So agrammatos, literally translated, it means illiterate, but it's not how we should like interpret the word in light of the context. There's more to Greek words than just being translated into another language. So we need to take into account like the specific speech community it's used in. The same thing with the word idiotes, even though it sounds like the word idiot. There's tons of references. There's tons of references. And I'll just share my notes right here. And it's using all these things in contrast to words like philosopher, physician, rhetorician, intellectual. So in other words, it's just generally saying like this is in contrast to the word to like somebody that's a lay person in specific to classical authors like kings, rulers, philosophers, physicians, rhetoricians, like I said. So this doesn't necessarily mean that they're saying like they can't write a thing. And I think
a modern equivalent might be like saying something like, white collar workers, saying these are just blue collar workers.
Yeah, exactly. And then I have some notes on here but this is something that maybe you want to talk about, Stephen, because you're the one who brought this up on the Sefer, Talmud, and Midrash.
Oh yeah. So I mean, I think who said it matters. If a Greek or a Roman would have made this comment, I think we would have to lean more toward some of the explanations you just gave, Than, or the potential that they were illiterate. But this is off the mouth of religious leaders that are Jews. So they have their own system in mind, because their conclusion was these guys have been with Jesus. So they're obviously thinking back to an individual in a certain landmark in a certain location and who they were trained by, their rabbi. Their rabbi was Jesus, because Jesus had an exception to his talmids, his apprentices, or his disciples, that others did not. So there's three forms of schooling in Israel. You have the Bet Sefer, the Bet Talmud, and the Bet Midrash. And it's believed that even guys and girls were educated in the Bet Sefer, which you would have memorized from the age of about 3, 4, 5 up to 12. You'd have memorized the Torah by song. You would have memorized by heart. If you were good enough and you didn't want to stop educating yourself, you would go to the Talmud, the Bet Talmud, and then you would learn the Tanakh. And then if you're really good enough, you would get trained in the synagogues outside of your local town. And if you were able to answer all the difficult questions of Torah and Tanakh, you would go out on a road, you would find a rabbi, you would chase that rabbi down, you would start dressing like him, you'd start sleeping in the same place as him, you would start changing your verbiage to his verbiage, and you would train, and that rabbi would ask you questions from your training, both in the Talmud and the Sefer. If he accepted you, then you were his disciple. Jesus flipped the whole system. He took a bunch of fishermen, tax collectors, assassins like Simon the Zealot, and he puts them on his team, calls them to be disciples, and they didn't go through the schooling program. Matthew may have. He would have been probably more educated being a tax collector, but the rest of these guys were fishermen, so they would have been educated through Sefer up to 12, and then they would have started in family businesses, like either carpentry or going into fishing, whatever it may be. And so they would have been educated not to the level Paul was. Paul would have gone through all three systems. So he'd have been very, very educated. That's why he was a disciple, and it mentions Gamaliel being his leader. That would have been the guy he was trained under. He went through all three phases. Peter, John, the rest, they would have been partially or mostly literate, enough to be similar to what a middle schooler probably would be today. They wouldn't have been the most prestigious writers out there. They were, but also Koine Greek was a trade language. I mean, this is how they did trade with other people. It was a common language to talk to other people that were bringing in transportation or purchasing things or selling things. So again, what they were talking about in Acts is these men did not go through our education program. So they concluded they went through Jesus's, which bypassed all these different things, and their rabbi was Jesus. That was the point of Acts. It had nothing to do with the fact that they were just dumb, didn't even know how to write the letter Aleph or Alpha.
This is a good book on arguing about the commerce thing you mentioned. The Greek was actually spoken quite a lot by people in that time. So Jesus very well may have spoken Greek.
Adding on to what Stephen was saying, when you think about when Peter denied Jesus 3 times, right? One of the ladies was like, "Hey, you're a Galilean. No, we can tell by your accent." Right?
Accent.
Yeah. And in the Talmud, multiple times, they're making fun of people from Galilee. There's a passage in the Talmud where it talks about Galileans hate the law. And so you got these Jerusalem elites and you got these Galilean fishermen. Of course, they're going to be like, "You're a bunch of dumb idiots who haven't studied like we have." They're just going to assume that they're hicks that are illiterate.
Yes.
And so they're the betters. And so it's just kind of like the same thing. Like, well, can any good come out of Nazareth? It's that same attitude.
Yeah.
And so I don't think this is all that mysterious. Look at who said it and where they're coming from. Yeah. So, yeah.
You guys ready to keep going?
Yeah. Let's.
That's another problem with names like John and Mark, even very common at that time. In the New Testament alone, there are 6 different Johns. There's John the Baptist, John son of Zebedee, John the father of Peter and Andrew, John a member of the Jewish council, John the nephew of Barnabas, and John of Patmos, the author of Revelation. So even if Mark and John were written by guys named Mark and John, you have another problem. How do you know it was that Mark and that John? Paul was another very common name in that time, and he makes sure that his audience knows who he is throughout the course of his letters. You've heard of me, how I persecuted the church, right? He's making sure they know it's him and not some other Paul. Again, the authors of the Gospels don't do anything like that. I'm not convinced that John the son of
Just to reiterate real quick, I mean, again, the alleged anonymity of the canonical gospel. Simon Gathercole points out, you're writing biography, you just left your name out of the bulk. There was only a title typically attached to the top. Philo omits his name from his biographies of Moses, Abraham, and Joseph. You just didn't do that. So you're not going to start a biography in the world writing like Paul was writing an epistle. This was a different genre.
Exactly.
Yep.
I was just going to say he's writing letters. You can't use Paul as a comparison.
Yeah.
You're comparing apples and oranges.
Paul's using his name to invoke authority because he's talking to the churches.
Yeah. Yeah. The same thing with John in the book of Revelation. He has no problem saying, I'm your brother John, who's a companion in the tribulation. I mean, he had no problem saying that. Why? Because he's writing a letter to 7 churches. He's not writing biography.
Right.
All right.
He is different from John the Elder alleged by Papias, but whoever he was definitely different from the John who wrote the Gospel of John.
It doesn't make any sense to wait until you've learned a completely new language to write down anything about the most important story you've ever been a part of.
That makes sense, but there's no reason to think the gospel authors didn't write something down that has just simply been lost to time. For example, the early church father Papias tells us that Matthew wrote something called the Logia in a Hebrew dialect, which may have been a list of early sayings.
Yes, the full quote is, and Matthew collected the oracles in the Hebrew language and interpreted them to the best of his abilities. But there's also something in this gospel that, even though it alleges to be what is said by Jesus, we don't find in any of the 4 Gospels. The elders who saw John, the disciple of the Lord, remember hearing him say how the Lord used to teach about these times, saying, the days are coming when vines will come forth, with each 10,000 bows, and on a single bow will be 10,000 branches. And indeed, on a single branch there will be 10,000 shoots, and every shoot 10,000 clusters, and every cluster 10,000 grapes. And every grape, when pressured, will yield 25 measures of wine. And when any of the saints grab holds of the clusters, will cry out, I am better, take me, bless the Lord through me. That isn't in Matthew or any of our Gospels, nor is there anything like that in any of our Gospels. So
yeah, I don't know what's the big deal.
This is clearly not talking about the same Matthew that we have. Just as one more nail into the coffin.
Okay, first of all, he says that John says that. Papias says that John says that, not Matthew.
Yeah, I was about to say, isn't it John anyway? It was John.
Yeah, he is saying that John says that. Okay, and I think he's trying to say John's just a big dummy. Obviously he's getting Jesus's words wrong because we know Jesus never said this. So how could he give us, accurate information about the Gospels? And so, I mean, I think that is something that we should think about when we try and place like too much weight on the idea of what the ancients were, so good at was like multi-chain links of oral tradition and all that other stuff. And so, yeah, they don't sound like anything that Jesus said elsewhere in the Gospels. But there are lots of opportunities for someone to get confused about stuff like that. But as far as like who wrote down the Gospel of Mark, this is like a way simpler fact and way easier to carry by tradition and less likely to produce confusion. Also, there's the very fact that Mark is a pretty obscure person, although I don't remember if Papias does even clearly connect him with John Mark in the book of Acts. But this would seem to support the accuracy of this attribution. And so the fact that it's being carefully attributed to a follower of Peter rather than Mark himself just kind of stands out. Again, it's just like, I don't know. I think he's making kind of more of a mountain out of a molehill here.
Yeah, I agree.
Often that is Papias. Bart Ehrman says that we have some evidence that John had disciples. We have no evidence that they were familiar with his gospel. Scholars have almost uniformly rejected just about everything else that Papias is recorded to have said in his surviving references to his work. Now, when it comes to the claim that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, there's another huge problem that often gets overlooked.
Let's stop there for a minute. So, did you want to say something, Stephen?
Well, Papias is only excused by Eusebius on things. And I think what keeps getting conflated is that Eusebius makes a single remark about Papias's view of eschatology, and he criticizes that, and he makes a pretty harsh comment toward Papias in doing that. But if he didn't think Papias was reliable, he wouldn't have corroborated him with Irenaeus and Tertullian on the matter. So here's what happens is people say, well, he said he's not reliable because he made the comment about the 1,000-year reign being literal and not. And so he pretty much said he's an idiot. Like that's pretty much what you said about him. Mm-hmm. But he also used what he believed to be true of Papias to evidence the Gospels with Tertullian, Irenaeus, and Clement. So he's using him as evidence. That doesn't mean he's disregarding him completely. And isn't it interesting that he doesn't tell us what Papias said about Luke or John? He only implies things about that because he clearly, and I think Bauckham may have pointed this out. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Michael. I think he rejects, Bauckham actually gives a hypothesis that he rejects giving any information about John from Papias because he disagreed with John.
Yes,
or disagreed with which John it was. So
that's actually Baukham's point. But Bauckham also points out Papias seems familiar with John's gospel based on his naming order, how he names people. He follows the exact order we see in the Gospel of John. So Eusebius probably left him out because they disagreed on who authored John. Papias may have identified another John. That's Baukham's main point. But he does seem familiar with the Gospel of John, and Bauckham lays out a pretty interesting case that he was familiar with it. So it's hard to deny that in my view.
Well, and even the Anti-Marcionite prologue, oddly enough, states that one of the scribes of John's gospel was Papias. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it's interesting. We do have an ancient attestation stating that Papias was one of the scribes doing John's gospel for him and writing it. Mm-hmm. I doubt it, but maybe. I mean, the point is what they're saying is he is familiar with it.
Yeah.
All right, ready to keep going?
Yep. We're almost
awesome.
We're almost home.
We're almost
there.
We're almost there.
And it's fairly obvious, I think, and there's plenty of accounts in the Gospels where there was nobody present, like Jesus being tempted in the desert by the devil for 40 days and 40 nights. Who told them that happened? Because we know Jesus.
Because he never told anybody.
The devil go to them and be like, "Hey, just so you guys know, before y'all met up with him, I tempted him in the desert. And he said these things." Okay.
Yeah, because Jesus never told his disciples what happened ever. That would never happen.
Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane before his crucifixion. It literally says in the text that he goes to be by himself and he tells his disciples to sleep and he goes off. And that's where he allegedly sweats droplets of blood. Of course, that was a later addition, but we'll get into that. So what? Did he come back and say, "Hey guys, wake up. I'm about to get arrested, so I need to tell you this really quick. I was just sweating blood because I was praying."
Because that's the last time they ever talked.
Write that down.
Ever.
Yeah.
30. So
no more conversations after that.
Language, if you could, that would be great.
Okay,
now,
so let me just read to this. Let me just read from this about him going off and praying alone. So he's wrong. The Gospels do not say Jesus was alone when he was praying in Gethsemane. On page 78 of Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes, they say, "We Westerners commonly think that Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, went to a private place in a garden of Gethsemane to pray. Actually, none of the Gospels say the place he prayed was private. Sit here while I go over there. Withdrew about a stone's throw behind him. He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and then going a little further. It is clear only that he separated from the disciples. At Passover, the garden was likely packed with people. It was not a good place to find privacy." And one of the things they note is that this is a Passover. You have a lot of pilgrims in Jerusalem, and a lot of people went to this area around this time to pray and to do certain religious activities for Passover. So Jesus was probably, this is why you needed Judas to point out Jesus in a crowd of people. There was a lot of people there. And again, it's very obvious that Jesus talked to his disciples after his resurrection. Luke mentions how he opened up the scriptures and revealed things about him. I mean, it's clear that Jesus was still teaching, and Luke mentions he was teaching the disciples 40 days. He could have told them this stuff. Again, it's not that hard. So again, this is just a weird argument for him to make. It doesn't follow. And yeah, Jesus was not alone. The gospel authors don't say that when he was praying.
Right. It's just overreading.
Yeah. All right, ready to keep going?
Oh, yeah, here's my favorite part.
Inspiring philosophy.
Yeah.
I have some appreciation for him because he puts more effort into his arguments than most apologists out there. But that's kind of a double-edged sword because the more you know, the more you have to ignore in order to make your information. You don't get to play the ignorance. I didn't know that card. Mike Jones almost certainly knows everything I've said in this video. As a matter of fact, I know he does.
Yep.
But he doesn't tell you any of it. He doesn't bring that up because it's counter to his argument. Maybe he has before in other videos. I'm not sure, but he definitely didn't in this one. He only picks what information he wants you to have to support his arguments. He doesn't show both sides. But that is the nature of apologetics. It is a dying field. Slowly but surely, a dying field. And cherry-picked information is what is needed to keep it on life support.
I do feel
so cherry-picked information.
The irony! Yeah, I need the iron right now.
So hold on, Dadpool. If you're watching this, which I'm sure you are, I love you. You're still my friend. But this was just the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Like, of course, Michael knows this. Of course, I know the stuff that you're going to appeal to. All of us here have read Ehrman. We've read the critics, right? But to just sit here and say something like, well, he doesn't want you to know these things. Let's interpret it this charitably, because I'm sure that you've read you've heard all the arguments that we have to give, right? And yet in your own videos, you never talk about the positive evidence for Christianity, the reliability of the Gospels, right? You talk about the evidence that you think is good. That's the same thing that we do in our videos. So in a small TikTok video, I think it's completely unreasonable to expect people to add in objections on all this other stuff. I just think it's complete hypocrisy.
Yeah, I mean, it is, because we could easily just point out he left out so many things. I mean, we talked about him getting P66 wrong earlier. We talked about him not mentioning a lot of the evidence we went over. I didn't go into a lot of the arguments Bauckham gave for the epilogue of John's Gospel. I mean, it's funny to me how I see anti-theist apologists like this constantly saying that we're biased, that we only want to show what you want. And then you see this kind of crap get pulled around. Okay, Captain Dadpool, you know damn well that was a 3-minute TikTok video. I'm giving highlights. I'm not going to have time to go into everything. I could go through numerous ones of your videos and go, well, you left out this moment. I could respond with this data that you didn't mention. Does that mean you are cherry picking data, that you don't want your audience to see things? No, because I'm going to try to interpret you charitably. Why is it that people that are so anti-Christian turn a lot of intellectual disagreement into actual personal attacks? It just shows me how you have a bias and an emotional reason for Christianity to be wrong. If that's how you take intellectual disagreement, you got to turn it into a personal attack. That shows more emotional connections to Christianity needing to be wrong in your own worldview. And so, no, I don't appreciate that at all. This made me lose a little bit of respect for you for that, because that last line there, that last minute, that was basically, poisoning the well. And it was uncalled for on so many levels.
Yeah. Yeah, that threw me off a little bit. I mean, most people that want to have a voice in a discussion, they wouldn't do. I mean, Ehrman would never do that. I mean, I've debated Richard Carrier on 2 occasions, and he has never said that or anything close to that. In fact, he would say that unless he changed his mind, that apologetics and apologists are becoming a trend. I mean, like, I don't think it's a dying thing. I mean, I might feel a little warm. I think I'm feverish, but I mean, other than that, I don't think, I mean, I might be dying physically, but I don't think apologetics is dying in that sense. It's actually, I think it's become a fad too much. I think there's people that need to get out of it, but that's another point. I was a little shocked that that was his approach. I mean, if you're trying to be scholastic, I wouldn't take that approach towards somebody or say that kind of thing. To me, that was degrading. It was unnecessary.
Well,
it was, one more thing. Again, it just points to my bias. It seems that a lot of these anti-theists, they turn intellectual disagreement into personal attacks. It's no longer just that we disagree. Yeah. It's now I have to use this to show you, my audience, how stupid and wrong you are, because you're clearly out to deceive everyone. Again, it's amazing how a lot of these people, it's almost like they need Christianity to be wrong, and it comes through when they make these kind of attacks. Their emotions come through in those attacks.
And before Eric jumps on there, I was doing a debate. We were just talking about it with Josh Bowen and Kip Davis the other day. And somebody actually posted something in the comments that said, these guys are lying and they know it. And Kip Davis stopped the debate and rebuked the audience and said, I think that is unfair. I don't think these guys are trying to deceive or lie to anybody. Kip Davis did that. And so if Kip Davis can do it, you can do it. It's fine. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think we need to, I mean, I always try and assume the best about who I'm critiquing. I very rarely talk about them personally. I get upset if I make a video response to like something, I don't know, Bart Ehrman said, or just take like an atheist YouTuber like Paulogia said. If I start to get comments criticizing that particular person and calling them stupid or dishonest or something like that, I call them out. If I see it and I'm able to correct it, I correct it. I don't like that kind of thing. I don't really understand this like idea to just like, I've debunked your arguments, everything you're going to say is stupid, and now I'm just going to assume that you have some sort of confirmation bias and that you're dishonest either with yourself or with somebody else. Like, it seems like I'm seeing this more on one particular side lately. I'm not saying it doesn't exist on the Christian side, but I think Because it does, you're just an atheist because you want to sin or something.
Yeah.
But,
and I think we would all equally rebuke that, right?
Yeah. I would think so. And so, yeah, and I think Michael has earned a little bit more of a benefit of a doubt than this, because he's constantly quoting scholars, and he's constantly even speaking out against like bad Christian apologetics.
Yes.
Sure. And so he's not like somebody who's not trying to like mitigate against his bias or just give you this one-sided thing. I've never really got that impression at all. So it's frustrating to see this. It's just like, it's completely unnecessary. I just try and assume that like, hey, somebody's probably just honestly mistaken in this. And until I can totally prove otherwise, there's just no point of even pointing it out. It's just like, basically, let me end this video with me dunking on you and attacking you, and it just doesn't
childish.
It just doesn't seem necessary. So anyways, that's all I have to say. In the words of Forrest Gump, that's all I got to say about that. So.
Yeah. And I think that was just important to speak on, because to me, it seems like a growing trend amongst counter apologists on the internet to psychologize people like us. And instead of like actually interacting with the arguments that we put up, just appealing to bias, psychologizing, and poisoning the well. And I think that's just really dangerous, because it destroys actual constructive conversation and like fruitful conversation that you can have. Because then everybody that's listening to you is going to listen to you. And I don't think you realize the amount of power you have to your followers, right? All those people that are listening to you, all of a sudden, they're going to refuse to listen to anything any Christian has to say. It doesn't matter if they're a PhD or anything, because they're all biased and whatever. And I just think it destroys the opportunity for actual constructive conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you want, check out a video I did about a year ago called "Are Christian Scholars More Biased?" or "Are Christian Scholars Biased?" And yeah, I just point out, there is some data that shows that in academic fields. So, I mean, this is stuff that's done by actual sociologists. There is some research that shows there is a little bit of Christian bias against Christian conclusions. There's this academic bias against anything that would support a Christian worldview. So, let's not try to continue that. Let's try to fight atheist bias and Christian bias. This is why I'm always trying to have conversations and talk more with people, because I want to overcome that and realize we're both humans on both sides.
Yep. All right, guys. Anything else you want to do or say before we got some questions in the chat from Pine Creek, but anybody else in the live stream, if you have questions, put them in now. You guys ready for questions?
Sure. Yeah, I can answer a couple, and then I got to take off in like 10 minutes.
All right. Yeah, that's good. We'll be on for another like you said 10 minutes, and we're gonna call it. All right. So question number 1. I wonder what % of eyewitnesses were still living when Papias talked to them. I wonder what year this would be.
Well, he mentions 3 or 2 specifically as the living and abiding. That would be Aristion and John the Elder. Whether or not that was John the Apostle, I think he makes a distinction. Apparently, by the time he'd have been writing that, John would have just died. Based on what we have from Irenaeus and Tertullian, John probably would have died between 101 and 102, if they're accurate, because they talk about how many years he was after Jesus' death. He died 68 years after. So it would have been about 101, 102. The way he's talking about them is if he had done that earlier or prior. And if he was alive in 60 AD, if he was born in 60 AD like we think he is, that would make sense. He'd have been in his 30s when he first heard John preach, as Irenaeus said he did. So John would have been dead by that point, and apparently there had only been 2 living and abiding voices left that he mentions. That's Aristion and John the Elder.
And Richard Bauckham again points out that when the standard custom of a rabbi in that time would be to take young men as your disciples, people that are going to live well past you. So, you're talking about disciples that are like around 33 AD or, early 20s, maybe mid 20s kind of thing. I mean, they're going to live much longer past that. And people would say like low birth, there's much lower life expectancy. Well, lower life expectancies in the ancient world were because of such high child and infant mortality. If you made it to 25, you were very likely to live past 50 and into your 60s even possible. So there very well were probably a couple living eyewitnesses by the time Papias had a chance to interview them.
All right. All right, so Pine Creek again asks, the first part of Luke doesn't claim to interview eyewitnesses, correct? And then he just kind of gives context. The question is about interviewing eyewitnesses in Luke 1 is because I thought I heard Stephen say that Luke 1 says eyewitnesses were interviewed, but it doesn't say that.
In Acts chapter 21, Luke travels with Paul. He's in Jerusalem. He's also with Paul when he's in prison. Like, he's not in prison with him, but it's Caesarea Maritima, which is, I believe, 75 miles away from Jerusalem. So he would have had plenty of opportunities to interview people, in the Jerusalem area at that time, and apostles and other witnesses.
Yeah, like Philip, when he was in Caesarea with Philip, that's where he got the story of the Ethiopian eunuch. He had 1 year time frame. So if you take the anti-Marcionite prologue and you take the Muratorian fragment in Acts, you put those together and you actually put the timelines together, because they said that Luke lived to be 84 years old. He died in central Greece. He wrote the gospel while in Macedonia when traveling with Paul. You could pretty much break down 56 to 57 AD. If you just take those three down: Acts, Muratorian fragment, anti-Marcionite prologue, the location it mentions, who he's with, what's happening around him. If you take Acts and follow the trend in Paul's second and third missionary journeys, I'm not saying that's a fact. I'm just saying that that's where those ancient documents would give you. But that gives him 1 year in Jerusalem, and about a year, right at a year in Antioch, where the headquarters was moved at that point anyway. Also, if you go through Codex D, fun fact, Codex D is a 5th century manuscript. It's got some weird readings in it, but it's really old in the sense of its mother manuscripts that go further back are pretty old. It actually starts the we passages when the famine is happening in Antioch earlier in the book of Acts, so that actually, if Codex D is right, then actually Luke would have been back all the way when the famine took place in Antioch, and he would have been there with Peter for a while too. We don't know. But at the end of the day, he does say that these things were delivered to them. And that he had received this information and took. That's what made his account better than the many, because actually Luke is a part of the many that took an opportunity to put an account together. Well, what made his so special that nobody else's did? Well, one, we learned that he was under Paul's ministry and Paul's authority, so Paul would have approved this gospel. And he says that from the beginning, where eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us. So he learned it from the eyewitnesses. He was ministered to eyewitnesses. And again, he traveled with Paul. So therefore, in Paul's journeys, he ran into Peter, he ran into James, he ran into Philip. So he did have time and resources to investigate the eyewitnesses.
All right. Okay. Daniel Lori asks, Mike, when are you going to debate Atheologica?
Well, I mean, he's refused to debate me, or at least just have a decent conversation with me multiple times. And at this point, he's hit on his channel behind insults and character assassination way too much that I just don't care anymore. He's taken scholars out of context. He has lied about my position. He's accused me of quote mining Trigway Manager when he's the one who did that. And again, I tried very politely to ask him to do conversation multiple times, and he keeps saying no. So at this point, I'm just not interested anymore. He's clearly not interested in having a rational conversation and trying to explore out each other's ideas. He just wants to push propaganda on at this point. So I'm done with him. I don't even care anymore at this point. So it's probably not going to happen.
Cool. All right. This might get really deep into the weeds. So
okay, I can answer this. I got this.
Okay, cool. I have a video on this. I think you probably have a video on this too, Mike.
So I did a video on Jesus versus Zoroaster because, some mysticists were saying that Jesus was a copy of Zoroaster. And in that video, I pointed out that a lot of what we know about Zoroastrianism comes from late documents that are even post-Christian. And even Zoroastrian scholars will note a lot of what we're getting about them actually comes from times when the Zoroastrian religious members were influenced by Islam and Christianity, and they were trying to keep people from going to those new religions. So they modify their religion a lot, their texts a lot, up until about the 10th century or so. So when people say like, oh, that Zoroastrianism influenced early Jewish beliefs, that's very speculative. It could be the other way around based on the textual data. We don't have any Zoroastrian text that would date, that would predate things like the Dead Sea Scrolls or, the putting together the Tanakh or these types of things. It seems you could say there might be some sort of influence going on that way, but it could very well just be the opposite. It's hard to say. And so it's all very speculative. I tend to think that it seems far more likely that the Zoroastrian cult evolved over time quite often from putting down the Avesta and then modifying about to the 10th century over time, because they were dealing with losing their own members to Islam and Christianity quite often, and they were sick and tired of it.
Yeah, so check out IP's video on that. I have a video called Was Jesus a Copy of Pagan Figures or something like that. I made it like almost 2 years ago. So I covered that as well on there.
That's a really good question.
Job Apologetics asks, is John 18:15 evidence against Johannine authorship? And I have it pulled up. So give me 1 second here. And it's this right here. Simon Peter and the other disciple were following Jesus because this disciple was known to the high priest. He went with Jesus into the high priest courtyard.
See, this is actually one of the things that Bauckham uses to argue that it is actually not John the son of Zebedee, it's John the Elder, who very well might be John, who is mentioned in excuse me, Acts 4, as being with the priestly family. So you sort of mentioned this off the cuff in Acts, like Luke says, John and like I think Aristion or Alexander were members of the priestly family and were there. So it's like, setting kind of like an eyewitness thing. And he argues that that's very well might be John the Elder, who was of the priestly family. And that's why John in the Gospel of John was allowed in to this courtyard, because he was already, they would have known him as a member of the priestly high family. So this actually is what Bauckham uses to argue that it's more likely John the Elder, not John the son of Zebedee. Now there's a lot in there. I know you guys don't, some of you guys like Eric, you don't agree, but I mean, there's a whole debate around that. And I think it's just an interesting debate to go into possibly.
I'm the last person in the world that'll say Richard Bauckham's wrong. I just say I kindly disagree because he's a hero of mine. But I understand. I think he makes a heck of an argument for sure. And that's one of the passages he uses.
Yeah, the first time I read it, I was not convinced. And then when I reread his second edition, and I was like, you know what? I think I am convinced of this. So yeah, I was originally more in the Zebedee camp, so I changed my view on that. Yeah.
I actually argue for the fact that John the Elder wrote 2nd and 3rd John, not John the Apostle. I think he was the penman and the writer of 2nd and 3rd John. And Jerome kind of indicates that as well. There was a really good question in there, Than. I don't know if you saw it a second ago. It was
real quick, just to
go ahead
on the traditional side of things. With joining authorship in that particular passage, I think it's Craig Blomberg that notes that in Mark 1:19 through 20, that John's father had hired servants, suggesting that John was probably more well-to-do than most people have realized, and that he could have just had access to Caiaphas's courtyard. I mean, it's safe to assume that a high priestly family wasn't just eating cheap fish, and so it's not completely unreasonable to think that a well-off fisher could have a chance to sell to the Jerusalem elite. So that's just a possibility. Bauckham's arguments are something to be taken into consideration. Either way, we have an eyewitness, so it's at the end of the day, it's not like a high stakes issue by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, I agree.
Fish in Galilee.
All right, I got one more question saved here, but Stephen, what was the question that you said you wanted to answer?
Is it free thinker? Is it free thinker? Yeah, very good. It was a great question.
Last question. So, do you take Mark in priority? If so, why? If the universal earliest testimony is in favor of Matthew, how does this impact your view of the earliest testimony of the authors in the second century?
I'll go first on this one. I actually do 2 entire videos on and podcasts on this. I hold Mark in priority when it comes to the Greek Gospels themselves. If you read those quotes carefully on the 2nd century, if you read all of them very carefully, they're telling you, including Papias, that he wrote in a Hebrew dialect, that Matthew had published something in Hebrew or Aramaic, one or the other. And it was originally, now he misquoted Papias, actually wrote this down. He misquoted Papias. He said that Matthew interpreted the best that he could. It's actually others interpreted as best as they could. And I demonstrate in a very short answer how I think that Matthew, came first in Hebrew. We don't have that version of it. Jerome was asked to translate it. He said he found a copy of it. It was given to him in the library of Caesarea. The Ebionites wanted him to translate it. So Jerome even tells a little bit about what might have been in it. A post-resurrection appearance to James, the brother of Jesus, James Just, apparently is in that document, but that's not in our Greek Matthew. So that tells me the Greek Matthew and the Hebrew Matthew are not identical. I think that Matthew collected his own personal eyewitness testimony of Jesus' teachings, major events, Sermon on the Mount, all the discourse, statements of Jesus. Because if you read Papias, he said it was the logia, it was the sayings. So I think what ended up happening is that when Mark's gospel was published in Rome, Matthew's gospel was only limited to Jews because every single one of those second century church fathers say it was written to the Jews converted out of Judaism in Hebrew or Aramaic. The problem is you cannot take the gospel to all the nations if you leave it in that language. It needs to go to Greek. So I think that actually the council of apostles still in Jerusalem after Mark actually published the gospel of Matthew using Mark's eyewitness testimony, Peter, Matthew's eyewitness testimony in Hebrew, and also working together as a group to publish a gospel for the headquarters. Because one thing we have to deal with is the most circulated gospel of the four in the earliest parts of the second century and late parts of the first century is Matthew. Matthew is the most circulated gospel of any of them. And that would only stand to reason if it was sent out from the headquarters of the apostles, which makes sense to me. It left from Jerusalem. We also have stories where individuals like Barnabas, James the Just is mentioned, as well as John the apostle himself, who are alleged to be part of translating the gospel of Matthew from Hebrew to Greek. In fact, it's stated that Barnabas actually was buried with his own copy of translating Matthew's gospel. So it's very likely to me that there were other witnesses there. So I think it's both. The church fathers are right. Matthew did write first, but read what they said. It was in Hebrew and Aramaic. And the data shows Mark's first. Well, it works if Matthew is using Mark's gospel in order to publish it as Peter's testimony corroborated with Matthew and some of the other eyewitnesses to publish it. And we see traces of Matthew's gospel. They have multiple places where there's Aramaic being taken into Greek or Hebrew being taken into Greek or explanations having to be done because it doesn't have the same punch in Greek. You can definitely tell that Matthew's gospel, it's the only gospel that doesn't use the Septuagint except for one verse. The others do. It clearly had a Hebrew origin. They did their own translation of it. So I think it's both. I think Mark is the first Greek gospel. I think Matthew's Hebrew gospel is the first gospel. So I think they're right, and I think the data is right.
Yeah, I got nothing. That was good.
Yeah, I'm good. I think, yeah. All right, guys. That was all for questions. I think we're good. Thank you, all you guys, for duking it out for 2 hours. Anything else you want to say before we close out here?
I got a video premiering on my channel tomorrow. Come check it out.
Awesome. I have a video premiering on Saturday. It'll be on Old Testament into New Testament pneumatology. So it'll be cool.
Nice.
All right, guys. Thank you, everybody, for watching this. And for those 100 of you that watched all the way through for 2 hours, you guys are amazing. Thank you so much. God bless. Until next time.